The smoke was still rising from Haven's Ridge when I walked into the High Council chamber and told them the raid had been a success. 40,000 humans. Gone. Or scattered. Or hiding in whatever caves and tunnels they had managed to dig before our orbital units finished the job. The colony had no fleet, no orbital guns, no shield array. They had 3 patrol ships, and those were destroyed in the first 6 minutes before a single alarm could finish sounding. The commander of our strike force, a decorated officer named General Korvath, had transmitted his completion report before the last fire on the surface had even gone out. He used words like clean and efficient. The council smiled and passed around cups of warm wine. I did not smile. I was not drinking wine. My name is Valsorn. I have worked in military intelligence for the Ketharan hegemony for 31 years. I have studied 100 species, read 10,000 threat assessments, and sat through briefings on every war the hegemony has fought in the last 2 centuries. My job is to find the thing that everyone else is not looking at. That day in the council chamber, surrounded by celebrating commanders and self-satisfied politicians, I was very much looking at the thing no one else was looking at. The colony beacon. Every human settlement above a certain population size carries one. It is a standard piece of emergency communication hardware, the kind of thing most species bolt onto the wall of a government building and forget about. In a crisis, it sends a distress signal to the nearest relay station. Standard. Ordinary. We had dealt with similar systems before in other raids. The beacon at Haven's Ridge had activated during the first minute of our attack, and our electronic warfare team had marked it as neutralized. But they had not neutralized it. Not completely. Our jamming had disrupted the signal, yes. But the beacon at Haven's Ridge was not a standard emergency transmitter. It was a military-grade data recorder tied to a high-burst transmission system. For 4 minutes and 11 seconds before our jamming fully overwhelmed it, that beacon had been sending, not just a distress ping, data, our ship signatures, our weapon frequencies, thermal profiles of every landing craft we put down, orbital approach vectors, the names and identification codes of the units that participated in the raid, pulled from open military band chatter that our commanders had not bothered to encrypt because they did not expect anyone to be listening. And the transmission had gone out in a tight beam pulse, aimed at a relay point 9.4 light minutes from Haven's Ridge, in the direction of Earth. I placed my report on the table in front of the High Primarch. He looked at it the way powerful people look at things they do not want to think about. He picked it up, read the first page, and set it back down. "You are being cautious," he said. "That is your job. But they are a Tier 3 species. They have no capacity to threaten us. Tier 3. That was the classification our survey teams had given humanity 18 years earlier. It meant a species in the early expansion phase, capable of interstellar travel, but lacking a consolidated fleet, lacking advanced weapons systems, lacking the unified political structure needed to mount any serious military response. Humanity at the time of that survey had been scattered across 11 colony systems, arguing among themselves about trade routes and governance models, and our analysts had concluded they were at least 40 years away from becoming anything we needed to worry about. That survey was 18 years old. I had tried to request an updated threat assessment 3 times in the previous 2 years. Each time I was told the resources were allocated elsewhere. There were more pressing concerns. The Velcanth border situation. The resource disputes in the Outer Rim. Humanity was a footnote. They were a species that quarreled with itself, that had nearly destroyed its own homeworld twice over, with its own weapons, that had spent most of its history cutting itself apart over ideology and territory. Our xenologists had a name for them. They called humans the fractured species. The logic was that no species so internally divided could ever present a unified external threat. That logic had a flaw that I had been writing about in internal memos for 6 years, and that no one had ever read carefully enough to act on. The flaw was this: humans did not need to be unified to be dangerous. They needed to be angry. I left the council chamber that evening with the celebration still going on behind me. I went to my office, and I pulled up everything I could find on human military history from the last 2 centuries. Not the survey summary, not the strategic overview, the actual history, the details, the wars they had fought among themselves, yes, but also the way those wars had ended, the weapons they had built, the doctrines they had developed. The speed with which a species that had been fighting primitive wars with simple weapons had, within a few generations, developed weapons capable of cracking the crust of a small moon. Humans did not evolve slowly. When they had a reason to build something, they built it fast, and they built it well. Every time in their history that they had faced a threat they could not immediately overcome, they had responded not by retreating, not by negotiating from a position of weakness, but by working until they had something capable of overcoming it. They had faced extinction from their own technology, and had survived. They had faced extinction from environmental collapse, and had survived. They had faced disease, famine, political collapse, internal war on a global scale, and they had survived every single time. Not because they were lucky, because they were relentless. I found a quote from an old human military theorist, written almost 300 years before their space age. The translation was rough, but the meaning was clear enough. It said, "In any conflict, the side that can absorb punishment longest and keep fighting will win. Everything else is noise." I sat with that quote for a long time. I also sat with something else I had found, a classified file that had been compiled by one of my predecessors, a senior analyst named Horath, who had retired 14 years earlier. The file was labeled Human Escalation Patterns, and it had been archived without ever being officially distributed to the Council. Horath had spent the last 8 years of his career tracking human responses to every external provocation they had faced during their expansion years. Mining disputes, border incidents, a case in the Delvin system where a Ketharan patrol ship had destroyed a human survey vessel by mistake, and the hegemony had issued an apology, but no formal reparations. In every single case, the human response had followed the same pattern. First, there was quiet. Sometimes days of quiet, sometimes weeks. Then there was a precise, detailed accounting of what had happened. Then there was a demand. Then, if the demand was not met, there was a response. The response was always proportional on the surface, but proportional in a very specific way, proportional to the full capacity the humans could bring to bear, not proportional to the capacity they had previously demonstrated. In other words, they never showed all their cards until they played them. The last entry in Horath's file was a note he had written to himself, and never sent to anyone. It said, "If we ever give them a real reason, we will not see what is coming until it is already here." Haven's Ridge was 40,000 people. They were not soldiers. They were miners, and engineers, and farmers, and teachers, and children. The colony had been operating for 22 years. The people there had built homes and planted gardens, and named the local star after the first child born on the settlement. I know this because I read the colonial registry that our intelligence teams downloaded from the settlement's administrative servers before the servers were destroyed. The first child born on Haven's Ridge had been named Elliot, after his grandfather. He would have been 22 years old at the time of our raid. His family had been listed as residing in Settlement Block 4, which was in the direct path of the first orbital strike. I did not sleep that night. What I did instead was pull up the beacon transmission log and run the numbers again. 4 minutes and 11 seconds of data transmission at high-burst military frequencies. The relay point the signal had gone to was a standard human communications node in a system called Kepler 442. From Kepler 442, the signal would have been automatically routed to Earth's Central Defense Command through a network of relay stations that the humans had built out over the last decade. A network that, I noted, was far more extensive and far more redundant than our last survey had indicated. The signal would have arrived at Earth Defense Command approximately 12 hours after the raid ended. I pulled up every piece of intelligence we had on Earth's current military capacity. The numbers were outdated, and I knew it. But even with generous estimates for upgrade and expansion, the picture they painted should not have worried me. Earth had a fleet. It was reasonably sized. It was equipped with weapons that were perhaps 2 generations behind our own. By any conventional analysis, they could not threaten the hegemony in a direct conflict. But something in the back of my mind would not let me rest. Something about the pattern, the quiet, the data transmission, the way they had built that relay network without us noticing how far it had grown. I wrote a report. I sent it to 4 different desks in the Council's Military Advisory Board. I labeled it urgent. I requested that we begin immediate preparations for a possible retaliatory response from Earth, including upgrading border monitoring in the systems between Hegemony Space and the Sol system, and initiating a diplomatic back channel to assess human intentions before any response materialized. Every single request was denied within 48 hours. The reason given in each case was the same. The threat level did not justify the resource expenditure. The Primarch held a formal celebration 3 days after the raid. There were speeches about strategic necessity and the proper exercise of power. General Korvath was given a commendation. The mineral extraction teams were already being deployed to Haven's Ridge to begin surveying the deposits we had taken the colony to obtain. I sat at the back of the celebration hall and watched the speeches and thought about Horath's note. If we ever give them a real reason, we will not see what is coming until it is already here. I looked at the clock on the wall of the hall. 31 hours had passed since the raid. Earth Defense Command had had our ship signatures, our weapon profiles, our orbital approach data, and the names of our units for approximately 19 hours. And we had heard nothing from them. Not a protest, not a diplomatic channel opening, not an emergency broadcast to the Galactic Council, not a single recorded transmission on any frequency our monitoring stations could detect. Nothing. And that, I realized as I sat in the back of the celebration hall listening to speeches about the great victory we had won, was the thing that should have been frightening everyone in that room, far more than any angry message could have. Because I had read enough human history to know exactly what their silence meant. It did not mean they were afraid. It did not mean they were calculating whether to respond. It did not mean they were reaching out to their allies or filing a grievance with some interstellar body. It meant they were already working, quietly, methodically, the way they always worked when someone had given them a reason. I left the celebration early. I went back to my office. I locked the door, and I pulled up a star chart showing the distance between Haven's Ridge and the Sol system, and then I pulled up every recorded instance in human history of a serious external provocation against a human settlement. I stayed up all night reading. By morning, I had a cold, clear understanding of what we had done. We had not raided a weak colony. We had pulled a thread on something vast and patient that had been sitting very still for a very long time, waiting for exactly the kind of reason we had just given it. The question was not whether they would respond. Humans always responded. The only question was how long it would take them to finish preparing, and what the response would look like when it came. I looked at my communications panel. Still nothing from Earth. No signal on any channel. The silence was enormous. It filled the room. It filled my chest. It was the loudest thing I had ever not heard. I picked up my pen and began to write a second report. This one I did not send to the council. This one I addressed to myself, dated and sealed, to be opened in the event of whatever came next. Not because I thought it would change anything, but because someone needed to record, clearly and honestly, that the warning had been given, that the signs had been there, and that the people with the power to act on them had chosen not to. That second report became the foundation of everything I am writing now. I rewrote that second report 4 times in the week that followed. I added details as they became available. I revised my estimates. I cross-referenced new intelligence as it came in. And slowly, piece by piece, the picture became clearer in a way that made everything worse. Our monitoring stations near the edge of human space began reporting unusual activity within 48 hours of the raid. Not military activity, industrial activity. The kind of large-scale manufacturing signature that you associate with a shipyard running at maximum capacity. We had 3 listening posts in the outer systems near the Sol boundary, old stations that ran on minimal power and transmitted compressed data packets once every 72 hours to avoid detection. 2 of those stations suddenly went silent, not because they had been destroyed, because something had come into range and actively jammed them. Whatever had jammed them was moving, and it was moving in a direction that was not toward any human colony world. I brought this to the attention of Commander Hellrath, who ran our Border Intelligence Division. He listened to my briefing, with the expression of someone who has already decided not to be concerned before the briefing begins. He told me that the jamming was likely a routine human military exercise, that such exercises were documented in our records as happening periodically in the outer systems, and that the silence from the 2 monitoring stations would resolve once the exercise concluded. And if it doesn't resolve? I asked. Then we will reassess, he said, in the tone of someone who fully expected to never have to reassess anything. That was day 6 after the raid. On day 9, the 3rd monitoring station, the one that had not gone silent, transmitted its compressed data packet on schedule. I was the one who decoded it. I was the one who sat alone in my office at 2 in the morning, looking at what it contained. The station had captured imagery, partial, low resolution, taken at extreme range, but clear enough. There were ships in that imagery. A lot of ships. Not moving in formation. Not yet. Assembling. The way you assemble something when you know exactly what shape you want it to take, and you are simply gathering the pieces before you put it together. I counted what I could make out in the imagery. I stopped counting at 60. There were more beyond the edge of the frame. I did not sleep at all that night. The next morning I went to the Primarch's office and I asked for an emergency audience. I was told the Primarch was in a trade negotiation with the Velcanth delegation and could not be interrupted. I asked to speak with Deputy Commander Shalor, who ran the military council. I was told Shalor was in a briefing. I asked to speak with anyone in military command at the level of senior advisor or above. I was eventually directed to a junior coordinator named Pelrath, who was 26 years old and had never served in intelligence. I showed Pelrath the imagery. He looked at it carefully. He asked how certain I was of the ship count. I told him I was not certain of the exact number, only that it was large. He told me he would pass the report up the chain and that I should expect a response within 72 hours. 72 hours. I walked back to my office and I looked at the star chart again, at the distance between where those ships had been assembling and the edge of hegemony space, at the speed of the fastest human vessels we had on record, which again were numbers that were 18 years old and almost certainly outdated. I calculated, I recalculated, I looked at the numbers for a long time. Then I opened a new file and I began writing the third report, the one I would never send to anyone, because by the time it might matter, there would no longer be anyone to send it to. What I wrote was simple. It was not intelligence analysis or strategic recommendation. It was just the truth, set down as clearly as I could manage. We had made a mistake. Not a political mistake. Not a strategic miscalculation. A fundamental, irreversible mistake of the kind that does not offer second chances. We had looked at a species that had survived everything the universe and its own worst impulses had thrown at it. A species that had come back from the edge of self-destruction, not once but multiple times, and had emerged each time not weaker but more capable, more organized, more determined. And we had decided that because they were currently quiet and internally divided and not pointing weapons at us, they were not dangerous. We had confused the stillness of a thing at rest with the stillness of a thing that cannot move. And now, somewhere in the darkness between their space and ours, 60 or more warships were assembling into a formation. And we still had not heard a single word from Earth. The silence had lasted 9 days. I was beginning to understand that the silence was not going to break in any way we were prepared for. On day 14 after the raid, Earth sent a message. I was in the monitoring center when it came in. We had been watching the frequencies around the clock since my report about the assembling ships had finally, slowly, worked its way up the chain far enough for someone senior to take it seriously. Commander Hellrath had eventually reversed his earlier dismissal and authorized a full-spectrum watch on all channels. Not because he believed my assessment, I think, but because enough people had started asking uncomfortable questions that doing nothing had become harder than doing something small. The message came in on an open diplomatic frequency, not encoded, not tight-beamed at any specific receiver, broadcast, wide, meant to be heard by everyone who had the equipment to listen, which in this part of the galaxy was quite a lot of species. It was not long. I have the original text memorized because I read it so many times in the days that followed. I will write it here exactly as it was received, translated from the English language as accurately as our systems could manage. To the government and military command of the Ketharan hegemony. 14 days ago, forces under your command conducted an unprovoked military operation against the human settlement of Haven's Ridge, resulting in the deaths of 39,812 civilians and the complete destruction of a settlement that had existed for 22 years. This is not a protest. This is not a request for negotiation. You have 72 hours from the time of this transmission to present the commanders responsible for this action to a tribunal designated by the Interstellar Compact for accountability proceedings. This offer will not be repeated. It expires once. That was all. No threat. No description of consequences. No list of demands beyond the one. No emotional language. No expressions of grief or outrage. No diplomatic formalities. Just numbers. 39,812. A 72-hour window. And the word, once. I read it 4 times in the monitoring center before the others in the room had finished reading it twice. Then I walked to a quiet corner and read it 4 more times. I want to explain what was frightening about that message, because on the surface it might seem like a fairly standard diplomatic communication. The frightening part was not what it said. The frightening part was what it did not say, and what that absence meant when you understood humans, the way I had spent the past 2 weeks, desperately trying to understand them. They had not described what would happen if the 72 hours passed without compliance. A weaker party making a demand always describes the consequences, because the description is part of the pressure. It is meant to frighten the recipient into compliance. A party that is genuinely certain of its position does not need to describe consequences. The consequences are self-evident to anyone who thinks clearly about the situation. The absence of a threat is only possible when the threat is so obvious that stating it would feel redundant. They also had not appealed to the Galactic Council. They had not filed a grievance. They had not asked any third party to intervene or mediate. A species asking for help announces, by that asking, that it believes help is necessary. Humans had not asked for help. And then there was the count, 39,812. Not approximately 40,000. Not tens of thousands. The exact number, which meant that in the 14 days since the raid, they had accounted for every single person. They knew who had lived, who had fled, who had been recovered, and who had not. That level of accounting, done that quickly, in the aftermath of a catastrophic attack, while simultaneously assembling a fleet in the outer systems, told me something very specific about the state of the human response operation. It was organized. It was thorough. It was running smoothly. They were not in chaos. They were not grieving in a way that interfered with function. They were doing what they always did when something terrible happened to them. They were counting. They were documenting. They were building the record that would justify what came next. I went directly to the Primarch's office. This time I did not wait for an appointment. The Primarch read the message in his chair with his hands folded on the desk in front of him. He read it twice. Then he looked up at me and said, "They want us to hand over our generals to a human tribunal." "They want accountability," I said. "The tribunal designation is from the Interstellar Compact, which means they have already been in contact with the Compact and have that body's agreement to host proceedings. That tells us they have been doing political work alongside the military assembly we observed." "Political work," the Primarch said flatly. "They have been building a case and building support simultaneously, sir. The diplomatic and military tracks are running in parallel. This is not improvised. This has been planned for at least 2 weeks, probably longer, possibly from the moment the raid happened." The Primarch was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They cannot threaten us. Their fleet is not capable of engaging the hegemony in our home systems. Even accounting for the ships you believe you observed assembling, the numbers do not support a serious offensive." "The numbers I observed are minimum figures," I said carefully. "The imagery was partial. We do not know the actual fleet size." "Even doubled," he said, "even tripled. We have 800 warships in active deployment within 3 systems of Kethara Prime alone." He was not wrong about the numbers. That was the problem with the argument I was trying to make. On paper, the hegemony's military position was strong. We had more ships, better documented weapons systems, deeper logistical infrastructure, home territory advantage. By every conventional measure of military power, we should not have been in any danger. But I kept coming back to the message, to what it did not say, to the silence before it, and the quiet certainty within it. "Sir," I said, "I would like to recommend that we take the 72-hour window seriously. Not necessarily compliance, but genuine exploration of what a response short of compliance might look like that would satisfy the core demand without requiring us to hand over military personnel. You want us to negotiate with a Tier 3 species that has sent us an ultimatum. I want us to not assume the tier classification is still accurate." The Primarch looked at me for a long moment. He was not a stupid man. He had run the hegemony's military council for 11 years and had navigated several difficult situations with considerable skill. But he was also a man who had spent his career in an environment where the hegemony's power was simply not in question. where the hierarchy of strength in this region of the galaxy had been established and stable for generations, and where the idea of a Tier 3 species presenting a genuine threat was so far outside the frame of normal consideration that engaging with it seriously felt, I think, like a kind of humiliation. "I will take your concerns under advisement," he said. It was the sentence powerful people use when they have already decided not to act. I left his office and went back to my monitoring station. The 72-hour clock was running. 41 hours remained. In those 41 hours, I did something I had never done in my career. I went outside the chain of command. I contacted an old colleague named Sova, who worked in the Hegemony's Foreign Affairs Division, and who had spent years cultivating quiet relationships with diplomatic representatives of a dozen different species. I asked Sova, without explaining why I was asking, whether she had heard anything from her contacts in the last 2 weeks, about any unusual diplomatic activity related to humanity. She called me back 4 hours later. Her face on the communication screen was careful and controlled in the way that people's faces get when they are trying not to show that they are alarmed. "How much do you know?" she asked. "Tell me what you know, and I will tell you how much I already have," I said. She leaned forward and lowered her voice even though, as far as I could see, she was alone in her office. "The humans have been in contact with the Interstellar Compact since day 2. They have filed a formal grievance with full documentation. Our ships were identified by hull signature. The commanders of each vessel are named. The unit designations are named. The order chain is traced all the way to Council authorization. That does not surprise me," I said. "What might surprise you," she said slowly, "is that 6 other species have filed supporting statements. 6, including the Pelvaran, who have not taken a political position on anything in 40 years. The Pelvaran, a species that was, by any measure, entirely uninvolved in the situation. A species that maintained strict neutrality as a foundational principle of their foreign policy, and had done so for 4 decades. Filing a supporting statement in a grievance against the hegemony was not the kind of thing they did, the kind of thing they ever did." "Who else?" I asked. She listed them. I recognized all 6. And I noticed something about the list that she either had not noticed or was not going to say aloud. Every one of the 6 species that had filed supporting statements had, at some point in the last 30 years, experienced a situation with the hegemony that had been resolved in our favor, in a way that had been, at minimum, uncomfortable for them. Nothing as severe as what had happened at Haven's Ridge, but incidents, pressure applied, trade terms that were not quite fair, border decisions that went our way because we had more ships, and they did not. Humans had not just been doing political work, they had been doing relational work. They had been talking to species we had pushed around, and those species had been listening. "Sova," I said, "do you have any intelligence on what the humans are doing militarily right now? Any indicators from your contacts?" She was quiet for a moment. "One of my contacts in the Delvin system told me 3 days ago that she had seen human military vessels transiting through Delvin space on a trajectory she described as purposeful. She said there were more of them than she had ever seen in one place before." "How many?" She stopped counting at 100. I thanked her and ended the call. I sat in my office with the star chart open on my desk, and I looked at the trajectory of Delvin space relative to hegemony space. Then I looked at the clock. 27 hours left in the 72-hour window. The Primarch was not going to act. I already knew it. The Council was going to let the window expire because they could not conceive of a world in which it needed to be taken seriously. And the 6 supporting statements from other species, and the 100+ ships transiting through Delvin, and the silence before the message, and the exact count of 39,812 dead, and the word "once" at the end of the message, were all things I could not make them understand in the time that remained. I wrote a 3rd memo. I attached everything: the beacon analysis, the monitoring station imagery, Sova's intelligence, the list of supporting species, the trajectory data. I sent it to 17 different people in the Council's structure, from the Primarch down to mid-level advisors, anyone who might read it and act. I sent it with an urgent classification marker that I did not have the formal authority to apply, but applied anyway. I received 2 automated receipt confirmations and 15 non-responses. The 72-hour window closed the following morning. And 12 hours after it closed, something happened that I had been dreading for 2 weeks, and that still, despite all my preparation, made me feel as if the floor had dropped away beneath me. Every border monitoring station we had in the outer systems went dark simultaneously. Not jammed this time, not degraded, dark, as if they had simply stopped existing. And then, on the long-range sensors of 3 different hegemony naval outposts near the boundary of our territorial space, something appeared. Something very large, moving with perfect, unhurried confidence in the direction of Kethara Prime. I looked at the sensor reading for a long time. Then I picked up my communication unit and called the Primarch's emergency line. He answered on the 3rd ring. He sounded as if I had woken him from sleep. "Sir," I said, "they are here." The Primarch was in the command center within 20 minutes. So was the full military council, the fleet admirals, the defense coordinators, every person in the hegemony's command structure who needed to be there when something like this happened. I was also there, standing against the back wall with my data files under my arm, watching the sensor displays and listening to the conversations around me. What they were seeing on the long-range sensors was not what they had expected to see, and the gap between expectation and reality was doing something interesting to the room. I watched it happen in real time. The conversations that had been loud and confident when people first arrived became quieter. Then they became precise. Then they became careful. The way conversations get when trained professionals realize that what they are looking at does not match any scenario they trained for. The formation on the sensors was not a battle group. It was not a task force or an expeditionary fleet. Those are things with defined shapes, doctrines, and operational parameters that military analysts can look at and classify. What was moving toward us did not have a defined shape. It was a mass. A moving mass of ships so densely packed on the sensors that at first there had been a brief, hopeful moment where someone suggested it might be a sensor malfunction. Admiral Kethar, who ran our home fleet, stood at the central display table with his hands flat on the surface and stared at the reading for a full minute without speaking. I had served under Kethar in a different capacity early in my career. He was a serious, experienced officer who did not panic and did not exaggerate. When he finally spoke, he said 4 words in a very quiet voice. "How many is that?" The sensor technician at the nearest console worked through the reading twice, adjusting for the density of the formation and the interference patterns at that range, and came back with a number. The number was not the 100 I had been told about in Delvin space. It was not the 60 I had observed in the earlier imagery. It was not any number that anyone in that room had been treating as a planning figure. The technician said the number. The room absorbed it. Several people around me stopped talking. One admiral put down the report he had been holding and did not pick it up again. The Primarch stood very still for a moment, and I could see from where I was standing that his hands, which had been resting on the edge of the tactical table, were now gripping it. I want to be precise here. The number the technician gave was not necessarily fully accurate at that range, with that sensor density. But even with the generous margin of error that long-range readings carry, the minimum possible interpretation of that number was enough to change the nature of every conversation in that room. It was more than we had. Not just more, considerably more. And these were human ships, which meant they carried human weapons systems, which meant the specifications our analysts were using to model their capability were based on data that was at minimum 18 years out of date, and very possibly far worse than that, because humans built fast and built well, and had had 2 weeks of absolute clarity about exactly what kind of conflict they were preparing for. The Primarch turned to me. I had not expected that. "How long have you known about this?" "I have known about the assembly for 9 days, sir. I did not know the full scale until this moment." "Your memos," he said. "Yes." He looked at me for a moment, in a way that was difficult to read. Then he turned back to the tactical display and said, "Get me a channel to their lead vessel." The communications officer worked for several minutes. The channel request went out. There was a pause. Then the response came back. The channel was acknowledged, but a connection would not be established at this time. They were not refusing to talk. They were not ready yet. They were indicating, politely but clearly, that communication would happen on their schedule. In the time that followed, our border outposts began reporting in one by one. The human formation had passed through each of them without stopping, without firing, without acknowledging the outpost crews in any way. The outposts had not been touched. Their crews were unharmed. The formation had simply moved past them the way a very large, very patient thing moves past small things that are not relevant to where it is going. Two of our patrol squadrons that had been operating in the outer systems moved to intercept positions. Standard defensive protocol. The formation responded by not responding, which continued until the first patrol squadron crossed a certain distance threshold, and then, very precisely, 15 ships detached from the formation's leading edge and repositioned to block the patrol squadron's approach vector. The patrol commander transmitted an identification challenge, as required by Hegemony Naval Protocol. The 15 human ships did not respond to the challenge. They simply sat in the blocking position. Perfect stillness. Engines running. Weapons systems, according to our sensors, in a state our analysts had to create a new category for, because active standby did not quite capture what the readings showed. The patrol commander consulted with Fleet Command. Fleet Command consulted with Admiral Kethar. Kethar, to his considerable credit, made the right call. He ordered the patrol squadron to hold position and not advance. The 15 human ships remained in their blocking position for 43 minutes, while the rest of the formation continued moving. Then they pulled back and rejoined the formation. No shot had been fired. No communication had been exchanged. And yet an entire interaction had occurred, with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and with a message that had been transmitted with perfect clarity. We know you are here. We are not concerned about you. Do not follow us. The second patrol squadron did not attempt an intercept. The formation continued toward Kethara Prime. I spent that time working at a side console, running everything I could find on human fleet doctrine, human command structures, human combat records from their wars, anything that might tell me what to expect. I found an old report from a hegemony observer who had been permitted to attend a human military exercise 12 years earlier. The observer's notes described something that had stayed with me even before all this happened. The observer had written, "What is most striking about human military operations is not their weapons or their numbers. It is their patience. In 3 days of exercises, I observed not a single instance of an officer or crew member acting on impulse. Every action was deliberate. Every decision went through a process. They do not fight with emotion. They fight with intention, and the intention, when it is present, is absolute. Absolute intention." I looked at the formation on the sensor display. I thought about that phrase. I thought about the 72-hour message that had contained no threats. I thought about the exact count of 39,812 dead that had been read out before the demand. I thought about the 6 supporting species, about the Pelvaran, who had not taken a political position in 40 years. And then the communications console lit up. The human fleet had decided it was time to talk. The face that appeared on the communication screen was not what any of us expected. The human commander was a woman named Claire Harmon. I know her name because it was listed plainly in the transmission header, along with her rank, her ship designation, and the formal seal of the Earth Defense Command. She did not enter the channel with theatrics or ceremony. She was simply there, in a plain gray uniform, with the focused, even expression of someone who has been doing a difficult job for a long time and has gotten very good at it. She was not young. She was perhaps 60 by human reckoning, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that tells you a person has made many hard decisions and is at peace with most of them. There was nothing threatening about her appearance. She looked, I remember thinking, like a senior physician, someone used to delivering information that was difficult to hear. The Primarch was at the central communication console. His advisors were arrayed behind him. I was off to the side, watching. "I am speaking to the governing authority of the Ketharan hegemony," she said. Her voice was even and clear. The translation system rendered it in near-perfect Ketharan standard. "I am Commander Claire Harmon, of the Earth Defense Command. I am authorized to speak on behalf of the government and people of the Terran Alliance. I want to inform you of what is happening and what will happen, so that you can make decisions with accurate information." That sentence alone was remarkable. She was not threatening. She was not demanding. She was offering clarity. Come to think of it, I cannot remember another military commander in any conflict I had studied opening a communication in quite that way, not with a declaration or an ultimatum or a recitation of terms, with information, with the offer of clarity. "Your 72-hour window closed without response," she continued. "We noted this. We are now proceeding to the next phase of our response to the attack on Haven's Ridge. I would like to share with you the specific nature of that response so that there are no misunderstandings about intent. The Primarch found his voice. He was a composed man, and he composed himself now with visible effort. Commander Harmon, before you continue, I want to make it clear that the hegemony does not recognize the authority of any human tribunal over its military personnel, and the actions taken at Haven's Ridge were conducted within the framework of hegemony strategic. I understand, she said, not cutting him off, just acknowledging. I am not here to debate the legal framework. I want to give you information. He stopped. Something about her manner made stopping the natural response. She was not playing the game he was trying to play. She was operating in a different mode entirely, one where there was no debate to win, only a set of facts to communicate. Our fleet will enter high orbit above Kethera Prime within approximately 14 hours, she said. At that point, we will conduct a targeted operation against hegemony military infrastructure. I want to be very specific about what that means, so I will list it for you. We will target military shipyards and dry dock facilities. We will target weapons manufacturing installations. We will target military command and communications centers. We will target orbital defense platforms. We will not target civilian infrastructure. We will not target agricultural, medical, educational, or residential areas. We will not target any site that is not engaged in direct military activity. The room behind the Primarch was very quiet. I could feel the quality of the silence. It was not the silence of people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of people absorbing information that was changing the shape of the world around them. Before our operation begins, Harmon continued, we will broadcast designated civilian evacuation corridors on all public frequencies. These corridors will be marked on a map that will accompany the broadcast. Civilians who leave the marked military sites and move to the designated safe zones will not be in danger. We are giving you this information now so that evacuation can begin before our fleet arrives. The Primarch stared at her. You are planning to announce your target list in advance. We are giving you and your civilian population time to move people away from the areas we intend to strike, she said. We do not want civilian casualties. We want accountability, and we want your military capacity reduced to a level where attacking a human settlement is no longer a practical option for any future hegemony administration. The precision of it was extraordinary, and I think that was the thing that finally, fully, landed in the room. Not the fleet, not the firepower, the precision. The fact that she had a target list and was announcing it, not because she was required to, not because it benefited her tactically, but because minimizing civilian harm was a genuine priority. The kind of genuine priority that you only have when you are in a strong enough position that announcing your targets does not create any vulnerability for you. You announce your targets when you know it does not matter whether your enemy knows them, because you can hit them anyway. Admiral Kethar, standing to the Primarch's left, leaned forward slightly. Commander, what is the total strength of your fleet? She looked at him, with exactly the same expression she had been wearing throughout the call. Admiral, I think you already have sensor readings. He did not ask again. The Primarch made one more attempt. He was a proud man and a capable one, and he was not willing to give up on the ground he was standing on without trying everything. Commander Harmon, the hegemony possesses weapons systems capable of significant damage to your fleet. An engagement here, in our home system, with our full defensive array operational, would not be a one-sided affair. That is correct, she said simply. He waited for her to continue. She did not continue. Are you not concerned about your fleet's losses? He asked. She considered this for a moment, not because she did not have an answer, I think, but because she was deciding how much of the answer to share. We are always concerned about losses, she said. We have read the names of all 39,812 people who died at Haven's Ridge. Our concern about losses predates this conversation, but concern about losses and willingness to accept them are not the same thing. That sentence went through me like cold water. It was, I realized in that moment, the most honest summary of human military doctrine I had ever heard. The willingness to accept losses, when the cause justified it, in the pursuit of a specific and clearly defined goal, was precisely the thing that had made humans dangerous in every conflict in their history. They did not fight wars of passion. They did not fight wars that ended when morale broke. They fought wars with defined objectives, and they accepted whatever cost was necessary to reach those objectives. and they did not stop until either the objective was reached or the objective was no longer achievable. And in this case, the objective was very specific. It was not conquest. It was not the taking of territory or resources. It was accountability, and the permanent reduction of the hegemony's ability to strike at human settlements, and a demonstration, broadcast to the rest of the galaxy, of exactly what the cost of hitting a human colony looked like. Those were achievable objectives. They were in fact almost certainly already achieved by the simple act of this conversation being heard by every monitoring station within signal range. The Primarch tried one more thing. He offered to discuss reparations. He offered, in careful terms, to discuss appropriate acknowledgement of the events at Haven's Ridge. He was careful not to say the word apology, and he was careful not to accept any framing that admitted direct responsibility. But he was offering something. Harmon listened to everything he said. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she said, "We presented a process for accountability and resolution 16 days ago. The window for that process closed. We are now in a different phase. I want to be clear. We are not here to punish your civilian population. We are not here to end the hegemony. We are here to make very certain that what happened at Haven's Ridge has a consequence that is proportionate and permanent, and that every other government in this region of space understands what that consequence looked like. And if we engage your fleet before it reaches Kethera Prime," the Primarch asked. "Then we will respond to that engagement," she said. "With what parameters?" She looked at him steadily. "Different parameters," she said. The call ended. She had initiated the close, calmly and without ceremony, the same way she had opened. The room was silent for perhaps 10 seconds. Then everyone started talking at once. I did not talk. I walked back to my console and sat down and opened the star chart and the sensor readings and looked at the human fleet on the display. Hundreds of contacts, moving in that steady, unhurried formation. 14 hours out. Kethar came and stood beside me. He was a man who dealt in numbers and logistics, and he was running numbers now. I could see it in his face. "There is no scenario in which a full engagement with that fleet ends well for us," he said quietly, not looking at me, looking at the display. "No," I said. "The border installations, the shipyards, the weapons platforms." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "How many civilian personnel work in the facilities she listed?" I had already looked this up. I told him the number. "And if we evacuate them before the fleet arrives?" 14 hours is sufficient for a full evacuation of all listed sites, I said, with time to spare. He nodded slowly. He was thinking about the same thing I was thinking about, I am certain of it. We were both looking at a situation that had already, in its fundamental shape, been decided. The only remaining question was whether the decisions we made in the next 14 hours would reduce the harm or increase it. Kethar went to speak to the Primarch. I do not know exactly what he said. What I know is that within an hour, the hegemony's public broadcast network transmitted an emergency announcement to the population of Kethera Prime, listing specific areas near military facilities and instructing civilians to move away from them as a precautionary measure. It was framed as a precautionary measure, but everyone listening to it knew what it meant. The next 12 hours on Kethera Prime were unlike anything I had ever seen in my 31 years of service. Orderly. There was panic in places, and there were people who refused to leave, and there were neighborhoods near the military districts where the streets were crowded with families moving away from the central installation areas, carrying whatever they could carry. But the infrastructure held, the transit systems ran, the emergency services functioned, because we had been given time, because Harmon had called 14 hours in advance and told us exactly where she was going to hit, and exactly where it would be safe to stand. I thought about Haven's Ridge. I thought about whether the people there had been given time, about whether Elliot and his family had known what was coming before the first strike hit Settlement Block 4. They had not. I stood at a window in the command center and watched the evacuation moving across the city below, and I felt something that I had not felt clearly until that moment, something that had been circling around the edges of my thinking for 2 weeks, and had finally arrived at the center. We had not deserved the time she was giving us. And she was giving it to us anyway. That was, I realized, a choice. It was also, in its own way, a message. Not just to us, to the entire galaxy that was watching. The Primarch convened an emergency council session 3 hours before the human fleet was projected to reach orbital range. I was invited to attend, which was unusual for someone at my level. I think Kethar had insisted on it. He wanted someone in the room who had been paying attention from the beginning. The session was fractured. Several council members wanted to engage the fleet. Several wanted to initiate last-minute diplomatic outreach through third parties. One member, an elderly politician named Venrath, who had been in government longer than anyone else in the room, sat quietly through the first 40 minutes of argument and then spoke. He said, "We are debating things that have already been decided. The only question that matters now is what we do in the next 3 hours to reduce harm to our people." The room got quieter. "We gave them 40,000 reasons to come here," he continued. "They are giving us 14 hours and a list of targets. That is not nothing. That is, in point of fact, more consideration than we showed Haven's Ridge. I suggest we receive it, in the spirit it was intended, and focus on what we can still control." Venrath was the oldest voice in the room, and also, in that moment, the clearest one. The debate shifted. Not toward surrender, exactly. Toward management. Toward deciding what of the remaining hours could be used to limit the damage, to protect people, to preserve what could be preserved. The decision was made to not initiate military engagement with the human fleet as it approached. Admiral Kethar would observe the operation and document everything, but our warships would not fire the first shot. The logic was simple, and Kethar stated it plainly. If we engaged and were defeated, we would have nothing. If we did not engage, we would have a devastated military infrastructure, and everything else intact. The civilian population, the government, the economy, the cultural institutions, the things that, in the long run, could be rebuilt from. The logic was correct. I know it was correct because I have lived in the 12 years since, and I can see what was preserved and what would have been lost. But I also know that accepting it in that room, at that moment, with the human fleet inbound, felt like standing at the edge of something vast, with no way back. The human fleet entered orbital range of Kethara Prime at 0347 local time. They broadcast the civilian safe zones exactly as promised, on all public frequencies, with maps, in clear language. The corridors were generous. The marked danger zones were precise. Anyone who read the broadcast and moved accordingly would be safe, and because the broadcast had been anticipated, because the evacuation had been running for 11 hours already, most of the people who needed to be out of the danger zones already were. I watched the first strikes from the command center's sensor displays, clean, precisely placed. The first military shipyard went dark on our sensors at 0412. The main weapons production facility in the northern district was struck at 0438. The orbital defense platforms were hit in sequence over the following 2 hours, each strike timed with a precision that told me they had planned this operation in detail before they ever arrived. There was no scatter. There was no collateral drift. Each strike went where it was supposed to go and nowhere else. Our own sensors, watching the human fleet as it conducted the operation, picked up something that I think is worth recording here, because it became a point of significant discussion in the weeks that followed, among those who were watching that night. The human ships that were not engaged in direct strike operations were doing something else. They were running interference patterns on our remaining defense platforms, keeping them occupied, preventing them from targeting the strike vessels. But the interference patterns they used were non-destructive. They were suppression, not elimination. Every defense platform that was not on the target list was suppressed during the operation and then released afterward, intact. They had taken the trouble to distinguish between what they intended to destroy and everything else, and to handle everything else accordingly. At one point during the operation, one of our remaining active defense platforms, in the eastern orbital zone, attempted a direct firing solution on a human strike vessel that had come within range. The platform's automated systems initiated a targeting lock. The human ship identified the lock and responded. 3 of its escort vessels moved into positions that placed them between the platform and the strike vessel, not to destroy the platform, but to physically block the firing solution. The platform operator, a young technician named Bryn who would later describe this to investigators, looked at what was happening and made a decision. He released the firing sequence. One of the escort vessels transmitted a brief acknowledgement on a neutral frequency, a single tone, not words, just an acknowledgement. Bryn later told the investigators that it was the strangest moment of his professional life. He had just been prevented from firing on an enemy vessel by an enemy that chose not to destroy him in the process, and the enemy had then thanked him for choosing not to fire. It was not a normal kind of war, he said. He was right. It was not. By 0900 local time, the primary phase of the operation was complete. Every target on the announced list had been struck. No targets outside the list had been touched. The civilian evacuation zones had been maintained throughout the entire operation. Preliminary casualty estimates from our emergency services put the number at under 3,000, the vast majority of whom were military personnel who had remained at their posts in the struck facilities. I will say that number again. Under 3,000. The human operation against the full military infrastructure of a major interstellar government, conducted with hundreds of ships over a period of 5 hours, had produced fewer civilian casualties than our patrol raid on a single undefended colony. The numbers said everything that needed to be said about the difference in intent, in planning, in execution, and in the fundamental question of what both sides had valued when they chose how to fight. At 0923, Commander Harmon opened a channel to the Primarch again. She said the military phase of the operation was complete. She said that a formal process for accountability would now be initiated through the Interstellar Compact, and that hegemony cooperation with that process was strongly recommended. She said that Earth had no interest in the collapse of the hegemony or the suffering of the Ketharan people, and that their representatives would be available to discuss reconstruction assistance for civilian areas that had been incidentally affected. She said one more thing before she closed the channel. She said it quietly, in a tone that was neither threatening nor triumphant. She said, "We remember what happened at Haven's Ridge. We will always remember it. We hope you will also remember this, not as a defeat, but as a lesson about the cost of choices. That is all we were ever trying to teach." The channel closed. In the silence that followed, Venrath, who was still sitting in the corner where he had been since the emergency session began, said nothing. He simply nodded once, very slowly, to himself. I understood the nod. It meant, yes, this is what I expected. This is what it looks like when a species that has had to learn things the hard way decides to teach. The question now was whether we were capable of being taught. General Korvath was arrested 2 days after the fleet withdrew. He was in his residence in the southern military district when the hegemony's own security forces came for him. He had not fled, which surprised some people, though it did not surprise me. Korvath was a career soldier who had spent 40 years operating within a system that rewarded exactly what he had done at Haven's Ridge. He did not believe, even at that point, that he had done anything genuinely wrong. He believed he had followed orders, executed a tactically sound operation, and achieved the stated objective. The fact that the world had restructured itself around him in the weeks since did not, from what I later learned of his state of mind, alter his fundamental understanding of his own actions. I was not present at his arrest. I was present at his initial formal interview, because by then my status had shifted in ways I had not entirely anticipated. The combination of my documented warnings and the accuracy of my assessments had elevated me, uncomfortably, into a position of unusual visibility within the hegemony's restructuring intelligence apparatus. People who had not returned my messages a month earlier were now sending me requests for consultation. It was a strange experience, being right in a situation where being right carried no satisfaction whatsoever. The Interstellar Compact Tribunal had begun organizing within 72 hours of the operation's conclusion. The process moved quickly, which was itself noteworthy. Compact proceedings on matters of this complexity typically took months to establish. This one had been pre-structured. Harmon had not been exaggerating when she said they had been in contact with the Compact since day 2. The documentation was already prepared. The legal framework was already agreed upon. The 6 supporting species had already formalized their statements. Everything was in place. The tribunal was not being organized in response to the operation. The operation had been conducted in preparation for the tribunal. That ordering of events was, I came to understand, the core of the message humanity had been sending from the moment the raid ended. This was not retribution followed by process. This was process, backed by the credible and demonstrated ability to enforce it. Korvath's interview lasted 4 hours. I sat in an observation room with 2 other intelligence officers and watched through a screen. The compact's lead investigator was a being from the Velcanth species named Coordinator Arash, and she was extremely good at her job. She was methodical, thorough, and completely without hostility, which I think Korvath found more unsettling than anger would have been. He answered her questions for the first 2 hours with the posture and the language of a man who believes the institution protecting him is still intact. He referred to the Havens Ridge operation as a sanctioned strategic action. He explained the military rationale in terms of resource security and territorial precedent. He was precise and professional. He was, in the way that certain kinds of people are when they are accustomed to operating within systems that validate their choices, completely confident. The third hour was different. That was when Arash began reading the names. She had a document in front of her that ran to 47 pages. She read from it in a clear, steady voice. She started at the beginning. She read each name. She read ages where they were on record. She read, in a few cases, brief descriptions of the person's role in the colony. A teacher, a structural engineer, a hydroponics technician, a grandmother who had been one of the original founders of the settlement. She read these without commentary or emphasis, just the names and the facts. After about 20 minutes, Korvath asked her to stop. She did not stop. He said that this was not relevant to the legal proceedings. She said, calmly, that the compact's process required a full accounting of harm, and that the names and identities of those harmed were part of that accounting. She continued reading. I watched Korvath's face change over the course of that hour. I want to describe this carefully, because I think it matters, and because I want to be honest about what I observed. It was not a straightforward reaction. He did not break down. He did not cry. He did not become visibly emotional in the ways that people do when they are confronted with something they know they have done wrong and have been avoiding. What happened was more complex and in some ways more difficult to watch. His posture changed. Incrementally, over the course of an hour of names, he became smaller in his chair. Not dramatically, just slightly. The way a person changes when something is pressing on them from outside, and they have no defense against it that is not physical. He could not argue with a name. He could not present a strategic rationale for a name. A name is not a category or a concept or a collective noun. A name is a person, and there were 39,812 of them. By the time Arash finished, the room was different. I do not know exactly how to describe this. The room was the same room it had been 4 hours earlier, but the quality of what was in it had changed. Arash set the document down. She looked at Korvath. She said, "These are the people your operation killed. You will have time to review the full document before we proceed." She stood, gathered her materials, and left. Korvath sat at the table alone for 11 minutes before the guards came back in. I watched him through the screen for all 11 minutes. He did not move. He sat very still and looked at the table, and I do not know what he saw in those 11 minutes. But I know that the man who had walked into that room 4 hours earlier, and the man who sat at that table, was not quite the same person. The tribunal would run for 3 years and 8 months. I testified in it. Several other hegemony officials testified. The documentary record was extensive, and the process was, by every standard I could apply, genuinely fair. This was something that several observers from the hegemony initially treated with suspicion, and eventually came to accept. The compact's process was not designed to produce a predetermined outcome. It was designed to establish an accurate record of what had happened, and to assign responsibility according to a defined legal framework. Some people in the hegemony were deeply uncomfortable with this. A fair process was, in some ways, harder to manage politically than an unfair one. A rigged tribunal you can object to. A rigorous, fair, transparent tribunal that finds against you is simply the truth, arranged in a form that can be transmitted to every inhabited system in the galaxy. Which it was. But I am getting ahead of myself. The tribunal came later. In the immediate days after the operation, the hegemony was dealing with the reality of what had happened to its military infrastructure, and what that reality meant for the near term. The shipyards were gone. 3 of the 4 main ones were completely destroyed. The 4th was damaged beyond short-term repair. The weapons manufacturing facilities, the 2 largest in hegemony space, were rubble. The orbital defense platforms in our home system, which had taken 30 years to build and represented the most significant defensive investment in our history, were non-functional. We had a fleet, still. Our warships in active deployment in the outer systems had not been touched. But without the infrastructure to repair, rearm, or replace them, a fleet is a finite resource. It is a clock running down. We were not defenseless, but we were no longer a power that could project force the way we had been before the raid. The capacity to do what Korvath had done at Haven's Ridge, that specific kind of operation, launching a strike against an undefended settlement with no credible threat of response, was gone. Not because we lacked ships, because the supply chain that made those ships sustainable was ash. And this, I realized slowly, was the actual architecture of what Harmon had done. She had not tried to end the hegemony. She had not tried to conquer us or dissolve our government, or install new leadership. She had removed, with precision, exactly the capacity that had produced the threat. She had done surgery, not demolition. The result was a hegemony that still existed, that still governed, that still had a population and an economy and a political structure, but that could no longer do what it had done to Haven's Ridge. Not for decades, maybe not ever, if the political consequences of the tribunal and the diplomatic realignment continued in the direction they were heading. I spent a great deal of time in those weeks thinking about the thinking behind that choice, about what it meant that a species capable of bringing that many ships to a single operation had chosen to use those ships in that specific and limited way, about what it said about what humanity valued, and how it defined victory. The answer I kept arriving at was uncomfortable, in a very particular way. It was uncomfortable not because it was strange, but because it was familiar, because it was, in fact, the answer that any moral and strategic analysis of the situation would have produced if it had been conducted honestly. You destroy the threat. You do not destroy the people. You make the behavior impossible, and you let the people who were not responsible for the behavior live with the opportunity to become something better. It was a doctrine I had read about in abstract terms, a philosophy of measured response. I had read about it in hegemony military theory, where it was described as ideal and rarely practiced. I had read about it in the histories of other species, where it was described as difficult and frequently abandoned under the pressures of actual conflict. Humanity had practiced it. Under the pressure of genuine grief and genuine anger at the loss of 39,812 people, they had practiced it. I found a human officer, a logistics coordinator attached to the diplomatic mission that arrived in the weeks following the operation, and I asked him directly. I told him I wanted to understand. I told him that I had been in the intelligence business for 31 years, and that I needed to understand what kind of doctrine produced the operation I had observed. He was a young man named Owen, with a patient manner and the slightly tired expression of someone who had been answering versions of this question for weeks. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "Look, we lost people at Haven's Ridge, real people. We wanted to make sure it never happened again. You can't do that by burning everything down. You do it by removing the specific thing that made it possible. That's just logic." Just logic. "But the anger," I said. 39,000 people. How do you hold that kind of anger and still operate with that kind of precision? He looked at me for a moment, in a way that was difficult to read. Then he said, "Who told you we were not angry?" He walked away before I could answer, and I sat with that question for a very long time. I have thought about Owen's question many times in the years since. I think I understand the answer now, though I could not have articulated it then. The anger was there. It had been there from the moment the beacon reached Earth, and the count came in, and the names began to be assigned to the numbers. The anger was absolutely present in every planning session, every diplomatic communication, every ship that assembled in the outer systems and made the transit to Ketharan space. You cannot read 39,812 names aloud in a formal session and tell me there was no anger in the room. The difference was that the anger had been channeled. It had been given a shape, a specific objective, a defined and limited target. It had been made to serve the strategy rather than override it, and the strategy had been written by people who understood something that our own military culture had never quite mastered, that anger, when it drives action without discipline, usually produces more of the same problem it is trying to solve. Humanity had tried the other way, in its own history. I had read about it. They knew what uncontrolled retaliation looked like. They had done it to each other for centuries. They had also experienced the aftermath of it, the way it created cycles rather than conclusions, the way it burned down things that could not be rebuilt, and damaged relationships that could not be repaired. They had learned this lesson internally, at enormous cost, And somewhere in the process of that learning, they had developed something that I can only describe as institutional restraint, a capacity to be furious and precise at the same time. That capacity was, I believe, what had frightened the galaxy into silence as much as the fleet had. The fleet was numbers. The precision was a demonstration of a kind of discipline that most species only ever aspired to and rarely practiced. Admiral Kethar came to my office on the 4th day after the operation. He sat down across from me without invitation and looked at the maps and files I had spread across my desk. He was quiet for a while. "What comes next?" he asked finally. Not an order or a demand, a genuine question, from a man who had spent his career knowing what came next and was now in territory he had not mapped. I thought about it honestly. Accountability, I said. The tribunal. Reconstruction. A very long negotiation about what the hegemony looks like going forward, and what our relationship with human space looks like, and what the galactic order looks like, when a species that was a Tier 3 classification 18 years ago turns out to have been something considerably more significant the entire time. "And the fleet?" he asked. "Their fleet. Returns to Sol system, I think," I said. "When the diplomatic framework is established, they have made their point. They do not want our territory. They want our military capacity reduced, and accountability delivered, and the galaxy watching. Those things have happened. Their interest is resolution, not occupation." He nodded slowly. "I read your early reports," he said. "The ones you sent before anyone was listening." "I know," I said. "You were right. I know that too." He looked at the map on my desk for a long moment. The star chart with Haven's Ridge marked, and the transit lines between there and Ketharan Prime and Earth. The distances, the numbers. 31 years in intelligence, he said. And you were the one person in this building who understood what we were looking at. "I read their history," I said. "That was all it took. Their history is very clear about what they are." "What are they?" I thought about the right answer. About Harmon's face on the screen. About Owen and his question. About the evacuation corridors announced in advance. About Arash reading names in a quiet room for an hour, without stopping. About the platform operator Bryn, and the single tone of acknowledgement from the escort ship. About a species that had come to the edge of self-destruction multiple times, and had come back each time not broken, but more capable and more intentional. "They are exactly what they say they are," I said. "That is what makes them different. They make a promise, and they keep it. They say they will do something, and they do it. They say they value something, and they demonstrate it under pressure, when it costs them. We did not believe that was possible. We thought it was rhetoric. And so we did not take the promises seriously. We did not take the warning seriously. We did not take the 72-hour window seriously, because we could not conceive of a species that was offering it sincerely." Kethar was quiet for a long time. "We will not make that mistake again," he said finally. "No," I said. "We will not." He stood. He picked up his uniform jacket from the chair where he had placed it. He looked at the star chart one more time, and then he left. I sat alone and looked at the chart, at the small marked point that said Haven's Ridge, at the distance between there and Earth, at the line I had drawn connecting the two, a line that represented the journey of a data burst that had lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds, and had traveled at the speed of light, and had arrived in a quiet room somewhere on Earth, and had set in motion everything that had followed. I looked at that line for a very long time. Then I closed the chart and picked up a pen and began to write what would eventually become the full record of everything I had witnessed. Not because I had been asked to, not because it was my assignment, but because someone needed to write it down clearly and honestly, in a form that could be read by anyone who needed to understand what had happened, and why, and what it meant. The intelligence briefings and the official reports would tell the facts. The legal proceedings would establish the record. But neither of those things would tell you what it felt like to be in that building when the sensor technician read out the number and the room went quiet. Neither of them would tell you what Korvath's face looked like during the 47th minute of names. Neither of them would tell you about Owen and the question he left me sitting with. Someone had to write that down. I was, apparently, that someone. The Galactic Council session that convened 3 weeks after the operation was the largest in recorded history. Not because of the number of species represented, though that number was significant. The session was large in the way that moments are large when everyone in a room understands that what is being said will be referenced for a long time afterward. Every ambassador, every diplomatic representative, every observer from every inhabited system that had a seat at the council, or a relationship with it, had either attended in person or was watching on a live relay. The session had been called as an emergency convening at the request of 14 different species simultaneously, which itself was unprecedented. I attended as part of the hegemony's reduced diplomatic delegation. The hegemony's full council representation had been suspended pending the outcome of the tribunal process, but we were permitted observer status at this session. I sat in the observer gallery with a clear view of the main chamber floor, and I watched. The first 3 hours were diplomatic, statements from various species expressing their positions, their concerns, their calls for various frameworks and processes and review committees. Much of it was, in the way of such things, formal and procedural. I listened carefully and took notes and followed the threads of alliance and concern and self-interest that ran through every statement. Then the human delegation spoke. The lead representative was not Harmon. Harmon was a military commander, and this was not a military proceeding. The human diplomat was a man named Philip Orwell, and he was exactly as different from Harmon in manner as his role required. He was scholarly in his presentation, patient in his phrasing, and he delivered the human statement with the careful precision of someone who has thought about every word before saying it and is confident in all of them. He began with Haven's Ridge. He placed the events there, again, in the exact terms they had been using consistently since the beginning. 39,812 people, named in the formal documentation already submitted to the compact, killed in an unprovoked military action by the Ketharan hegemony. He stated this without drama. He acknowledged that the Earth Defense Command had subsequently conducted a military operation against hegemony military infrastructure in response to that attack. Then he said something that I had not anticipated, and that I later came to understand was the most important part of the entire statement. He said, "Earth does not stand before this council to be congratulated. We stood before you today to make a record. The record is this. A member of this galactic community attacked an undefended human settlement and killed 40,000 civilians. The galactic community did not prevent this. The existing frameworks for accountability were not fast enough, strong enough, or sufficiently backed by enforcement mechanisms to create a deterrent. We experienced this failure directly, and we responded to it directly. We do not claim that what we did was the only possible response. We claim that it was a necessary response in the absence of functioning alternatives." He paused. "What we are asking this council for is not recognition or approval of our actions. What we are asking for is a conversation about why those actions were necessary, about why a species in this region of space was able to classify another species as a lower tier, assign them less value, and act on that assignment, with weapons and without consequence until the target of that action was capable of creating consequences themselves. We are asking why the tier system exists, who it serves, and what we intend to do about the fact that it has now produced the outcome we are all sitting here processing." The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms get quiet when someone has said a thing that everyone in them knows is true, but that no one has said aloud in quite that form before. I watched faces from my position in the observer gallery. I watched diplomatic representatives from species that had been classified below the hegemony in the tier system for years. I watched representatives from species that had also, at various points, experienced what the tier system enabled. I watched them listening to Orwell, and I watched something in the quality of their listening that told me the political landscape of this region of space had already changed, and that this session was not determining whether it would change but simply marking the moment of change formally. Orwell continued for another 40 minutes. He was specific. He cited cases, beyond Haven's Ridge, where tier classifications had been used to justify behavior that a functioning accountability system would have prevented. He was not strident about this. He presented it as analysis rather than accusation. But the analysis was devastating because it was accurate, and because the documentation he submitted to the council in support of it was extensive and could be verified. By the time he finished, the hegemony was not the only government in the room facing uncomfortable questions. I wrote in my notes that afternoon, "The tier system is dead. Not officially yet. Not formally voted out or legally abolished at this session, but politically dead. The argument for it has been made and refuted in front of the entire galactic community in a single session, and no one in that room is going to rebuild it from this rubble. I was right. It took another 2 years for the formal review and revision of the classification system to be completed, but the political outcome of that review was predetermined from the moment Orwell sat down on that day. The afternoon session was given over to questions from other delegations. Many were directed at the human delegation. Many were what I would describe as cautious interest, from species that had been lower in the hierarchy, and were trying to understand the implications of what had just shifted. One question came from the representative of a species called the Talvin, a small and peaceful civilization that had for decades operated under what amounted to economic pressure from several larger powers, including the hegemony. Their representative asked, in careful and diplomatic language, what the human position was on the obligations of powerful species toward less powerful ones within the new framework being proposed. Orwell answered without hesitation. He said that the Terran Alliance's position was simple, that capacity obligates responsibility, that a species capable of defending itself was also, by that same capacity, capable of taking on obligations toward others who could not yet defend themselves, that the existence of power without accountability was the fundamental problem the events of the past month had exposed, and that the solution was not the absence of power, but the presence of genuine accountability structures that applied to all. "We are not asking to be trusted," he said directly to the Talvin representative. "And trust is built over time. We are asking for the structures that make trust possible to be built, structures that apply to us as well as to everyone else. We are willing to be accountable. We are asking that everyone here be willing to be accountable. That is the only sustainable basis for what we are calling a community." The Talvin representative was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Would the Terran Alliance be willing to sign a mutual security agreement with species who lack your current military capacity on the basis of those principles?" Orwell said, "Yes." That exchange lasted approximately 2 minutes. It would turn out to be the foundation of what became the Compact of Accord, which by the time I am writing this has 16 member species and a formal review structure that has already intervened successfully in 3 potential conflicts. I sat in the observer gallery and wrote in my notes and thought about the decades of quiet diplomatic work that had gone into that 2-minute exchange, about the relationships humans had built with species the hegemony had dismissed or pressured over the years, about the 7 species that had filed supporting statements with the Compact before the operation, about the network they had spent years constructing, not because they had anticipated exactly this sequence of events, but because they had understood that relationships with other species were worth building even when they offered no immediate tactical advantage. We had spent our resources on ships and weapons and orbital platforms and mineral extraction contracts. They had spent their resources on relationships and listening and showing up when other species needed something and not always asking for something in return. The difference in those 2 approaches was now visible to the entire galactic community. At the end of the day's session, I encountered Sova in the corridor outside the gallery. She had attended as part of the hegemony's foreign affairs contingent. She looked tired in the way that people look tired when they have been processing a great deal of information, and not all of it has been comfortable. She said, "Did you know they had been building this? All of it? The relationships, the compact connections, the documentation process?" "Not the full extent of it," I said. "I knew they were more than the survey indicated. I did not know how much more." She was quiet for a moment. "They had been preparing for this for a long time," she said. "Not for Haven's Ridge specifically, but for the possibility of something like it. They had been building the capacity to respond to it for years." "Yes," I said. "Because they knew," she said slowly, "that eventually, someone would." I had not thought of it in exactly those terms before, but yes, that was exactly right. Humanity had not been building toward conflict. They had been preparing for the moment when conflict found them, because they had enough history to know that it would. They had been hit before. They had been underestimated before. They had learned from every one of those experiences, and they had built something that meant that the next time it happened, they would be ready. Haven's Ridge had not been the first time someone had hurt them. It was simply the first time the response had been large enough and public enough that no one in the galaxy could pretend not to have noticed. I stood in the corridor and thought about Horath's note, written 14 years earlier by an analyst no one had listened to. If we ever give them a real reason, we will not see what is coming until it is already here. We had given them a reason. We had not seen it coming. And the entire galaxy had watched it arrive. The months that followed the council session were among the most disorienting of my professional life, and I say that as someone who had just lived through an experience in which his own civilization's military infrastructure had been systematically dismantled by a fleet the size of which none of our strategic models had anticipated. What was disorienting was not the political fallout, though there was significant fallout. It was not the tribunal process, though that was demanding and occasionally painful. It was something smaller and more personal. It was the steady stream of things I encountered that forced me to revise my understanding of humanity in ways that my intelligence work had not prepared me for. I had understood humans as strategically sophisticated. I had understood them as historically resilient, as institutionally disciplined in their military operations, as diplomatically active in ways we had underestimated. These were all facts I had arrived at through analysis. What I had not arrived at through analysis, because it does not show up in threat assessments or fleet counts or diplomatic filing records, was the texture of how they operated at the level of individual encounters. Owen was one example. The question he left me with, the refusal to pretend the anger was not there, but also the absolute clarity that the anger was not driving the decisions. Bryn, the platform operator, was another. He told his story to investigators, and I read the transcript. The tone he received from the escort ship, the acknowledgement, the thank you. A gesture made in the middle of a combat operation, at some cost in time and attention, because someone on that ship had thought it worth making. There was a medic attached to the human diplomatic mission named Fiona Caldwell. She had come with the teams that arrived after the operation to assist with humanitarian assessment in the affected zones near the struck military facilities. I encountered her working in a district near the destroyed northern shipyard, where some civilian structures adjacent to the facility had sustained incidental damage despite the precision of the strikes. She was treating a Ketharan man whose house had lost part of its roof from the shockwave of a nearby strike. I watched her work for a while. She was efficient and calm, and spoke to the man in basic Ketharan standard that was accented but functional. She had clearly been learning the language, not because anyone had required her to, as far as I could determine, because she was going to be treating Ketharan patients, and she had decided it was worth knowing how to talk to them. I introduced myself after she finished. I told her I was in intelligence, and that I had been trying to understand the human approach to the response operation. She looked at me for a moment, with the measuring expression of someone deciding how much energy to spend on a conversation. "What do you want to know?" she asked. "How you are able to come here and do this," I said, "after everything that happened." She handed the medical kit to her assistant and sat down on a piece of rubble that had been cleared to the edge of the street. She was quiet for a moment. "Did you know anyone at Haven's Ridge?" she asked. "No," I said. "I did," she said. "I had a colleague who was working in the medical center there. She'd been there 4 years." She looked down the cleared street toward the remains of the shipyard in the distance. She was in the building when the first strike hit. I did not know what to say. I said nothing. "I am not here because I am not angry," she said. "I am here because there are people here who need help, and I am trained to help them." Those two facts exist at the same time. You learn, eventually, how to carry both. She stood and picked up her kit and walked back to the work. I stayed where I was for a while. The street around me was quiet. The rubble had been cleared to the edges. The man whose roof had come down was already back inside what remained of his house. Somewhere further down the block, 2 children were playing, which struck me as the most ordinary and extraordinary thing I had seen in weeks. You learn, eventually, how to carry both. I turned that phrase over in my mind for days. It was, I came to think, the most compressed description of the human capacity I had been trying to understand since the day I read Horath's file. The capacity to feel something fully and still function precisely, to be furious and still make the right call, to grieve and still treat a patient whose civilization's military had killed someone you cared about. That capacity was not the absence of emotion. It was the deliberate, trained, practiced management of it, not suppression. Management. The way you manage a very powerful force, not by pretending it does not exist, but by understanding it completely and directing it. I found historical accounts of how human military and civilian responders trained this capacity. There were long traditions of it, practical programs, philosophical frameworks, centuries of developed understanding of how to function in the aftermath of terrible things without being destroyed by the terrible things or by the responses to them. It was not innate. It was built, deliberately, by a species that had had to learn, over and over and over again, that being destroyed by your own response to destruction only doubled the damage. They had had to learn this lesson many times, in many forms, at many costs. And they had built institutions around that learning that preserved it across generations so that each generation did not have to relearn the same thing from scratch. I thought about the hegemony's own history, about the wars we had fought, about what we had built from them, about what we had preserved and what we had let go. The comparison was not comfortable. I wrote in my journal, in those months, the difference between a species that survives terrible things and a species that grows from them is not talent, or strength, or intelligence. It is the willingness to look at the terrible thing honestly, to account for it completely, to build the lessons into the structure of what comes next, and then to go and treat the patient in the rubble of the city that your enemy's fleet just struck, because she is a patient and you are trained to help people. It is a kind of discipline so fundamental it does not look like discipline anymore. It looks like character. I did not admire it easily. I had spent too long in a system that had been organized around very different principles, and admiration was not a comfortable sensation in that context. But I had spent 31 years finding the truth in situations, and the truth in this situation was not available in any other shape. The hegemony began its formal cooperation with the tribunal in the 4th month after the operation. It was a slow and sometimes painful process. There were factions within the government that resisted, that looked for procedural escape routes, that tried to frame the accountability process as politically motivated. They were not wrong that politics were involved. Every formal proceeding at this scale has politics involved, but the substance of the proceeding was real, and the documentation was real, and the names were real, and no amount of procedural maneuvering changes those facts. I testified twice. The first time, I presented my intelligence analysis and the timeline of my warnings and the council's responses. The second time, I was asked about the decision-making culture within the hegemony that had produced the raid. This was a harder testimony. It required me to be honest about things I had been part of for 31 years, systems and assumptions and priorities that I had navigated, rather than challenged, and which I could not now, in a formal legal proceeding, pretend I had been unaware of. I was honest. It was not comfortable, but I had decided some time before that testimony that the only legacy worth leaving in this situation was an honest record, and that a record kept clean by omission was not clean at all. The tribunal found Korvath guilty on several counts, 18 months after it opened. The Primarch was found guilty on separate counts the following year. Several other officials faced lesser findings. The sentences were structured around accountability and restriction, rather than punitive confinement, which generated debate in several quarters, but which I found, on reflection, consistent with the logic of everything else the humans had done. You make the behavior impossible going forward. You do not spend all your energy making the past as terrible as it can be made. There was a morning, about 7 months after the operation, when I arrived at my office and found a package on my desk. It had come through the human diplomatic mission, forwarded from their Earth office. There was no covering letter. Inside was a simple printed document, the full colonial registry of Havens Ridge. Every resident, every name, every age and profession and years of residence, every family unit. The notation, beside each name, of their status: evacuated, relocated, deceased. 39,812 deaths recorded in precise and careful text, and below that, in a smaller section, the survivors, the people who had gotten out before the strikes hit, the people who were now living in temporary settlements in other human systems while Havens Ridge was assessed for rebuilding. Their names too, their current locations, their status. I sat at my desk and read the entire document. It took 2.5 hours. I did not rush it. When I finished, I put it in the drawer of my desk where I keep things I need to return to. I have read it many times since. Every time I read it, I find it does the same thing. It refuses to let the 39,812 become a number. It keeps them as people, specific people with specific lives. That, I have come to think, is the most important work anyone did in this entire situation. Not the fleet, not the tribunal, not the council session, keeping them as people. The fleet protected, the tribunal established, the session restructured, but the registry named. And naming, it turns out, is not a small thing. It may in fact be the most important thing. Haven's Ridge was rebuilt. It took 4 years. The human government funded the initial reconstruction. Several other species contributed materials and labor through a framework established under the new Compact of Accord. When I say several other species, I mean that the Talvan, who had no particular historical connection to Haven's Ridge and had not been harmed by anything that happened there, sent 300 engineers and 30,000 tons of structural composite because they had decided that being part of the rebuilding was part of being part of the new order they were trying to create. I learned about this when I visited Haven's Ridge in the 5th year after the raid. I had requested permission to attend the opening of the memorial that had been constructed on the site of the original settlement center. The request had been unusual. A Ketharan intelligence official requesting to attend a human memorial for the dead of a colony his own government had destroyed was not a routine application. It took several months to process. In the end, it was approved. I think the decision to approve it was made by someone in the human diplomatic structure who understood what I was trying to do, which was simply to be present in the most honest way I knew how to be present. The memorial was simpler than I had expected. I do not know what I had expected, something more monumental perhaps, something designed to emphasize the weight of what had been lost in a way that would be impossible to stand near without feeling crushed by it. What was there was a large flat stone in the center of what had been the settlement's main square. The square had been rebuilt around it. The new buildings were functional and modern, and the square itself was already beginning to feel used, the way public spaces feel used when people walk through them regularly, and sit in them, and let their children run across them. The stone was dark and polished, and the names were cut into it in rows, small and precise, each one with a date of birth and a date of death, running across the surface in the patient, dense pattern of 39,812 entries. It took a long time to read even a fraction of them. At the base of the stone, in text large enough to read from the edge of the square, was a single line. It was written in 6 languages, including Ketharan Standard. It said, "We remember, so will you." I stood at the memorial for a long time. There were other people there. Mostly human, some survivors returning to the rebuilt settlement, some from elsewhere who had come specifically for the memorial dedication. A few representatives of other species. I was the only Ketharan present. An older man named Alan came and stood beside me after a while. He introduced himself. He told me he had been one of the original founders of the settlement, 30 years earlier. He had been off-world at the time of the raid, which was why he was still alive to be standing there. He said this without particular weight, in the way people state facts about their own lives that they have had years to make peace with. He asked me why I had come. I told him I had been the person in the Ketharan government who had known what was coming and had not been able to stop it, and that I had thought it was important to be here. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the stone. He said, "How many people were in that government when the decision was made?" I told him the approximate number. He nodded slowly. "My son built houses," he said. He was 34. He was quiet again. He had a daughter named Mira. She was 8. I did not try to say anything. There was nothing to say. After a while, he said, "I'm glad you're here. I think it matters. Being here. Showing up in person to face what happened. That's not a small thing." I thanked him. I meant it completely. We stood at the stone for another 10 minutes in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Then he walked away, slowly, toward a group of people who were gathered at the edge of the square. I stayed a while longer. I read as many names as I could in the time I had. Not all of them. There were too many. But I read until I had to leave for my return transit, and I memorized the ones I read, because it seemed like the minimum of what I could do. On the return journey, I wrote for several hours. I had been writing the account that would become this document for years by that point, adding to it section by section as events unfolded, and my understanding deepened. On the flight back from Haven's Ridge, I wrote the section I had been approaching for a long time and had been putting off. I wrote about what we had actually done, Not in the framing of strategic necessity or resource security, or any of the other language the Council had used. In the plain language of what happened. We had sent ships to a settlement of 40,000 people, most of them miners and their families, who had no means of defending themselves, and we had destroyed it, to access the mineral deposits beneath the ground they had been living on. We had killed 39,812 of them. We had classified them as lower tier, in a system that allowed us to treat that classification as justification, and we had gone home and had wine. Writing it in those terms, without the framing, made it clear in a way that all the analysis and strategic context and historical perspective had not made it clear. It was simply wrong. Not strategically unsound, though it had proven to be that as well. Not politically inadvisable, though it had proven to be that too. Simply wrong, in the most basic sense of the word, in the sense that requires no framework or classification system or strategic context to understand. I had known it was wrong before the raid. That was what my warnings had been about, at least in part. Not just the strategic risk, the wrongness of it. The way you cannot classify a person as lower tier without first deciding that they matter less, and you cannot decide they matter less without being willing to act on that decision, and acting on that decision produces Haven's Ridge. I had not said it in those terms in my warnings. I had said it in the language of strategic risk and operational exposure and threat assessment, because those were the terms that might have been listened to in the hegemony's decision-making culture. The terms of basic right and wrong would not have landed the same way. I knew this, and I had made the calculation. I have had a great deal of time to think about whether that calculation was the right one. I think it was not. I think that when the moment arrives, when you know something is wrong, the place to start is with the wrongness. Not because it is more likely to be heard. It may be less likely to be heard. But because the record matters. Because the intelligence officer who files a memo saying, "This is strategically risky," has made a different contribution to history than the intelligence officer who files a memo saying, "This is wrong, and here is why, and here is what will happen as a consequence of its wrongness." The hegemony's culture would not have listened to the second memo any more readily than it listened to the first. But the second memo would have been truer, and the truth of it would have been part of the record, and the record is not nothing. I mention this because a young intelligence analyst named Petra, who had been assigned to work with me during the tribunal process, asked me once what advice I would give to someone starting out in our field. She was 24, and earnest, and very good, and I thought carefully before I answered. I said, "Learn to distinguish between what is true and what is useful to say. Then say what is true, even when the useful thing is different. Not because the useful thing does not matter. It does matter. But the truth has a way of being useful eventually, and the useful thing has a way of stopping being useful much sooner than you expect. Also, read their history." She asked whose history. "Anyone you might one day underestimate," I said. "Read their history carefully and honestly, and without the lens of how you have already decided to see them. Read it as if it were a briefing on a genuine threat, because it is. Everyone's history is a briefing on what they are capable of when they have a reason." She thought about this for a moment and then said, "Even ours?" "Especially ours," I said. She has become, in the years since, one of the best people in our restructured intelligence apparatus. She reads histories. She has a habit of filing memos that say, in addition to the strategic analysis, whether the thing being considered is right or wrong. Several of those memos have changed decisions. I count that as one of the better outcomes of everything that happened. The Compact of Accord held its first formal session with all 16 member species 2 years after the Council session. I attended as part of the hegemony's new diplomatic delegation. We were a member now, not a founding member, not a leading voice. A member that had signed the framework and committed to its obligations, and was in the early stages of demonstrating, through behavior over time, that the commitment was genuine. Philip Orwell was at that session. I encountered him at a reception afterward and introduced myself. He knew who I was. He had read the testimony. He was gracious about this in a way that did not feel performed. I asked him, as I had asked several humans by that point, what the real goal of the entire sequence of events had been. Not the official statement, the actual goal. He looked at me for a moment, thoughtful. "To make it less likely to happen again," he said. "To anyone, not just to us." "And do you believe you've succeeded?" He tilted his head slightly. "Ask me in 20 years," he said. "This kind of thing doesn't have a success that you can point to. It has a direction, a trajectory. You build the structures and you maintain them, and you hope the trajectory holds. And if it doesn't hold?" He picked up his glass. "Then we go back to the structures," he said, "and we ask what they were missing, and we build again." He said it without drama, the way you say the obvious thing when it really is the obvious thing, and you have made your peace with it. I understood then what I had been slowly understanding for years. The humans were not operating from a position of triumph or certainty. They were operating from a position of long experience with difficult realities. They had built and rebuilt many times. They had learned, at great cost, that the only thing you can control is the quality of what you build and the commitment you bring to maintaining it. That was not heroism in the storybook sense. It was something quieter and harder and more durable. It was endurance with intention. And it was, I had come to believe, the most genuinely powerful thing in the galaxy. I want to spend some time here on what the hegemony became in the years that followed, because the account of what happened is not complete without an honest account of the aftermath. Not just the political aftermath or the military aftermath or the legal consequences, but the internal change, the slow and uneven process of a civilization that had to look at what it had done and decide what to do with that knowledge. It was not a clean process. I want to be clear about this because accounts of this kind have a tendency to smooth over the difficulty and present a before and after picture that suggests a cleaner transformation than actually occurred. The hegemony did not become something entirely different. People who had believed certain things for their entire lives did not stop believing them the morning after the operation. The tier system had been built into the assumptions of our culture at a level much deeper than policy, and policy changes faster than culture. There were people in the government and the military and the civilian population who spent years in genuine denial about the scale of what had happened and what it meant. There were also people who understood immediately, who had, perhaps like me, suspected some version of it for a long time, and who used the clarity of the event to reshape what they were doing and how they were doing it. Petra was one of those people. Kethar was another, in his way. Venrath, who had been the only voice in that emergency council session to name the reality plainly, spent his remaining years as an advisor to the Reconstruction government, and was one of the most important figures in shaping how the new institutional framework was built. The reconstruction of the hegemony's military, when it eventually happened, was deliberate and constrained in a way that would not have been possible before. The tribunal's findings had produced a set of binding conditions on rearmament, and while there were factions that resented these conditions, the experience of what had happened when we operated without them was recent enough and vivid enough to carry political weight that kept the conditions in place. What we rebuilt was smaller and more defensively oriented. It was not designed for the kind of offensive operations that had produced Haven's Ridge. It was designed to protect our own territory, to patrol our own borders, to respond to genuine threats, and to contribute, in a modest way, to the Compact's collective security framework. It was, in other words, a military that existed for the purposes we always claimed our military existed for, rather than for the purposes it had actually been used for. I am not going to pretend that this transformation was purely voluntary or entirely principled. Much of it was compelled by circumstance. We had the choice between rebuilding in accordance with the Compact's framework or rebuilding outside of it, and facing the consequences of that choice from a galactic community that had now watched, in real time, what those consequences looked like. The incentive structure was not subtle, but I also believe that within the circumstance, genuine change was happening. Not uniformly, and not without resistance, but happening. I saw it in the younger people coming into the intelligence service and the diplomatic corps. They had grown up with the record of what had happened publicly documented in a way that was very difficult to revise or minimize. They had grown up knowing the names of what had been lost, and why it had been lost, and what the world looked like when someone with the capacity to create consequences decided to create them. They were not, as a generation, defined by guilt. I want to be clear about this because guilt is not a productive state, and a culture organized around it becomes self-absorbed in its self-criticism, in a way that does not actually serve the people who were harmed. They were defined, rather, by a clearer understanding of certain realities than my generation had possessed. They did not need to be convinced that tier classifications were dangerous. They had grown up in the wreckage of that particular error. They did not need to be taught that power without accountability produces predictable outcomes. They had watched the accountability arrive, and they understood the connection. This was not comfortable for everyone in the older generation, and I include myself in this. There is something difficult about being instructed by history, in the form of people who grew up after you made the mistakes the history is about. But it is also, I came to understand, the mechanism by which cultures actually change, rather than simply adjusting their rhetoric. I worked with a young woman named Dara in the years after the tribunal. She was in the Foreign Affairs Division, and she had been assigned to the team handling the hegemony's relationship with the new compact structure. She was efficient, politically perceptive, and she had the habit of asking why, at a level that went deeper than most people were comfortable going with. She asked me once, during a difficult meeting about the details of one of the compact's accountability review provisions, why I thought the hegemony had been so confident before the raid, what the source of the confidence was. She was asking me to explain something that had always been obvious to me from the inside, but that she, having grown up after it, could not quite understand from the outside. I thought about how to answer honestly. I said, "We believed that the classification was real, not just as a strategic tool, as a true description of reality. We believed that species lower in the tier system were genuinely less significant, less capable, less worthy of serious concern. We believed it not because we had examined the evidence and concluded it, but because the system told us it was true, and we had grown up inside the system." She was quiet for a moment. "But you had evidence to the contrary," she said. "You had been writing about the inaccuracy of the human classification for years." "Yes?" "And no one listened." "No. Because they believed the classification." "Because they believed the classification," I said, "and because believing the classification was comfortable, and believing my analysis was not, and because the cost of being wrong about the classification had, until that point, been paid by the species on the other end of it, rather than by us. There is a great deal of confidence available to you when the costs of your errors fall on someone else." She sat with this for a long time. Then she said, "That's the thing the compact is trying to fix, isn't it? Making the cost fall on the right party." "That is one way to put it," I said. She nodded and returned to the meeting documents. But I thought about that exchange for a long time afterward, because she was right, and the simplicity of what she had identified was both the most obvious thing and the most important thing. Systems that allow costs to fall consistently on those least able to resist them, while the benefits of those systems flow to those most able to enforce them, produce exactly the kind of outcome we had produced at Haven's Ridge. The compact's framework was an attempt, imperfect and ongoing, and requiring constant maintenance, to change that alignment, to make the costs of harmful behavior fall on those who chose the behavior rather than those who experienced it. It was not a perfect mechanism. No mechanism of this kind is perfect. But it was a genuine attempt, and it was backed by the demonstrated willingness of species with genuine capacity to enforce it when it failed. And that combination, imperfect mechanism plus genuine capacity plus demonstrated willingness, was more than had existed before. It was not everything, but it was more. And more, in this kind of situation, is the best you get. I retired from active service in the Intelligence Division 8 years after the raid. I had been offered a position in the new Joint Intelligence Framework being developed under the Compact, a role that would have kept me working in the field I had spent my career in. I declined it. I had decided that what I could contribute at that point was not more analysis, but the record I was writing. This document is that record. I have been working on it for 8 years. It is not finished in the sense that the events it describes are not finished. The tribunal process concluded. The compact structure is established. Haven's Ridge is rebuilt. Korvath served his term of restriction and is now in private life. The Primarch underwent his accountability proceedings and has been out of government for 6 years. These things are done. But the thing they represent, the question of what kind of community we are building in this region of space, and on what principles we are building it, is not done. That question does not finish. It is answered every day by the decisions that governments and individuals and institutions make, and those answers accumulate into the trajectory that Orwell was describing when he said the goal was a direction rather than a destination. I am writing this for the people who will be making those decisions after I am gone, for the intelligence analysts who will read their history, for the diplomats who will decide whether to take a message seriously or file it under ignored, for the commanders who will calculate whether a particular action is worth its cost and who bears that cost, for the people at every level of every kind of institution who face the moment when the comfortable thing and the right thing are not the same thing. This record is not triumphant, and it is not despairing. It is honest, to the extent I can make it honest. And it ends, in this section, where all honest accounts of failures eventually end, not with the failure, but with the question of what was built from it. What was built is imperfect and incomplete and ongoing, but it is more than we had, and it was built with the full weight of 39,812 reasons to build it properly. I am going to let that be enough. There is a thing that happens when you have been carrying a weight for a long time and you finally set it down. Not relief, exactly, more like recognition. The recognition of how heavy it was, which you could not quite measure while you were carrying it. I set down my official role in the intelligence service on a gray morning, in what was, by the human calendar I had come to use alongside our own, the 8th year after the raid on Havens Ridge. The paperwork was minimal. The office that I had occupied for 22 of my 39 years in the service was cleared into 3 boxes that did not take long to carry to the transit station. I left the building on foot, which was something I had not done in years, and I walked for a while without any particular destination. The city had changed. This is perhaps obvious, but the change was more interesting than simply the rebuilt and repaired structures. Though those were visible, the change was in the quality of what was happening in the streets. There were human diplomatic staff in the Central District, which had been true for 8 years now, but had never stopped having a slightly dreamlike quality to it for me. There were Talvin engineers in the reconstruction zones in the outer districts, finishing the last phases of the infrastructure work they had committed to. There were children of 6 or 7 different species in the public school near the transit station, a thing I had been told about but had not seen in person until that morning. I stood on the corner and watched children of 6 or 7 different species enter a school building together, and I thought about what the world looked like the morning after the raid, when the Primarch was accepting congratulations, and the wine was flowing, and the idea that any of this was possible would have been treated as absurd if I had tried to describe it. The world turns, as they say, but it does not turn on its own. Someone has to push. I visited Petra at her office before leaving the district. She was working on 3 things simultaneously, which was her normal operating mode, and she managed to pause all 3 to say goodbye in a way that felt genuine. She had become, in the years we had worked together, one of the people I respected most in my field. She had the rarest combination, intelligence that understood complexity, and the honesty to describe things simply, when simplicity was what was true. She gave me a small package as I was leaving. Inside was a printed document. It was a copy of the Colonial Registry of Havens Ridge, the new one, the updated version, with the reconstruction census, the names of the original residents who had survived, now listed with their current addresses in the rebuilt settlement, and below them, new names. People who had moved to Havens Ridge in the years since the reconstruction, who had chosen to settle in a place that had become, in the strange way that places become things in the consciousness of a civilization, a name that carried meaning. The settlement had grown. Not to its previous size yet, but growing. There were children there now who had been born after the raid, in the rebuilt settlement, on the same ground, under the same star. I stood in the corridor outside Petra's office and held the document for a moment. "Life is stubborn," she said. I agreed with her. I left the building. I walked to the transit station. I boarded the connection that would take me to the private residence where I intended to spend the next period of my life, finishing this document. On the journey, I read the new registry. I read the names of the people who had come back to Havens Ridge, and the names of the people who had chosen to be there for the first time. I read the ages. I read the professions. There were miners, still, because the mineral deposits were still there, and someone had to work them, though the working was now done under the framework of the new resource agreements negotiated through the compact, which meant the humans who worked them did so under protections and with compensation that the old hegemony model had not offered anyone. There was also, and this is the detail I have returned to most in the months since, a medical center listed in the new registry, staffed partly by humans and partly by Talvin, with a visiting program that brought in practitioners from 3 other species in the compact. It offered care to the settlement's residents, and to any traveler who needed it. Fiona Caldwell had helped design the program, I was told. I do not know whether she worked there herself. I hope she does. I finished the registry about 3 hours into the journey. Then I put it away and looked out the window at the stars for a while. You can look at the stars from almost anywhere in this part of the galaxy, and understand, in a very physical way, that the distances between things are enormous, and the time it takes for anything to cross those distances is significant. The light reaching my eyes from the nearest visible star left that star 4 years ago. The star might have changed since then. It might be surrounded by different conditions. Something might have happened there that I could not know about for 4 years, because that is how long it would take the information to reach me. I find this comforting, which probably says something specific about my personality. The universe does not change at the speed of decision. The consequences of decisions take time to propagate, but they do propagate. They cross the distance. They arrive. A data burst lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds, transmitted from a colony under attack, and traveled to a relay point 9.4 light minutes away, and from there, across the human communications network, to a quiet room somewhere on Earth. And what arrived in that quiet room set in motion a chain of events that produced every single thing I have been describing in this document. The fleet, the tribunal, the council session, the compact, the rebuilt settlement, the medical center designed partly by a woman who had lost a colleague in the attack and had come to help anyway. All of that, from 4 minutes and 11 seconds of signal, because the people who received the signal were paying attention and understood what it meant and had the capacity and the willingness to respond. I thought about what the galaxy would look like if more of us had been paying that kind of attention for that many years, with that much willingness to respond to what we saw. I thought about it for a long time on that journey. I am still thinking about it. In the last year, I have had 2 experiences that I want to record here before I finish, because I think they belong in this account, and because they are, in different ways, the images I expect to carry with me longest. The first happened when I was contacted by a young historian named Sam, from a small institute at one of the human universities that had taken on the task of building a comprehensive archive of the events surrounding Haven's Ridge. He was writing a chapter on the decision-making within the hegemony in the period before and during the response, and he wanted to interview me. I agreed, and we spent 3 days in a series of conversations that he recorded and that I was told would become part of the archive's oral history collection. On the last day, after the formal interview was finished, we were sitting in the garden of the place where I was staying, and he asked me something that had not been part of his prepared questions. He asked me what I thought the most important thing was that had come from all of it. I thought about it for a while. I could have said the compact. I could have said the tribunal process, or the end of the tier system, or the rebuilt settlement, or any number of the structural and political changes that had come about. These were all real and significant. But what I said was this: the thing I keep coming back to is the count, 39,812. The fact that they counted, exactly, and kept the count, and read it aloud, every name, in a formal proceeding, and put it in every document, and engraved it in stone on the settlement that was rebuilt. That the number was never allowed to be approximate, or a range, or thousands. It was always exact, because every one of those was a person, and a person does not round down. Sam was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My grandfather counted." I looked at him. He was on the team that compiled the registry, he said. After the raid, he went through all the records. He told me once that it was the hardest thing he had ever done, and also the most important thing. He said the whole time he was doing it, he kept thinking, every number I get right is a person who is fully counted. Every number I get wrong is a person who is not. I did not know what to say, so I said, he was right. I know, Sam said. He said the same thing about the names. He said the names matter more than the number, because the number is what happened to them, and the name is who they were. He wanted people to know who they were. The second experience happened more recently, about a month before I finished this document. I received a message through the Diplomatic Mission Forwarding Service. It was from a woman named Carla, who introduced herself as the granddaughter of one of Haven's Ridge's original founders. Her grandmother had survived the raid, She had been in an underground transit tunnel when the first strikes hit, part of a group of about 40 people who had sheltered there and emerged to a destroyed settlement. She had remained in the reconstruction effort for all 4 years and had helped rebuild the medical center. She had died the previous year, at the age of 81, in Havens Ridge. In the settlement she had helped build twice. Carla was writing because she had read, in an archive, the intelligence reports I had filed in the weeks before the raid, the ones warning about the strategic risk. She wanted me to know that she had read them. She said that she understood I had not stopped what happened. She said that she did not know whether my warnings would have changed anything even if they had been heard, and that she had spent time thinking about this and had concluded that probably they would not have, because the decision had been made by people whose minds were not in a place where warnings would have reached them. She said she was not writing to thank me. Exactly. Because what I had done was my job, and what had happened regardless. She said she was writing because she thought I should know that someone had read those warnings, that someone who had a stake in what they described had read them, and had found in them something that mattered to her, which was simply the fact that someone had been paying attention, that someone in the hegemony's intelligence apparatus, in the weeks before everything, had been sitting with the evidence and writing the truth of what it said. She said, "My grandmother told me that the hardest thing, after the raid, was not the loss. It was the feeling that it had not been seen, that we had been so thoroughly classified as not worth noticing, that our destruction had barely registered as a real event, until the response made it impossible to ignore." She said that feeling, of not being seen, was in some ways harder than everything else. Your reports did not save anyone, but they saw us, and that matters to me, so I wanted you to know. I read her message 3 times. Then I sat for a long time without doing anything at all. I am finishing this document today, not because the story is over, because it is not over, but because a document needs an ending, even when the events it describes do not. I will submit it to Sam's archive, and to the Compact's historical record, and to the hegemony's own intelligence archive, where it will sit alongside the warnings I filed 39 years ago that no one read carefully enough. I have one final thing to say, and I want to say it plainly, because plain language is what it deserves. Do not underestimate what you cannot see. Tier systems and classification hierarchies and strategic frameworks are tools for organizing information, and like all tools, they can be used well or badly. They are used badly when they become a reason not to look, when the category substitutes for the observation, when the classification tells you what something is before you have actually studied what it is. Humanity was not a Tier 3 species when we surveyed them. They were what they had always been, a species shaped by their history of surviving terrible things, who had developed over centuries a capacity for endurance and precision and relationship building that was, by any honest metric, extraordinary. We did not see this because we used the classification as permission not to look, and what we did not see cost 39,812 people their lives, and cost us everything we have spent the last 12 years rebuilding from. Look at what is actually there. That is the lesson. It is very simple. It costs nothing to apply it, and the cost of not applying it is the number on the stone in the square at Havens Ridge, carved small and precise, every name exactly right, because every one of them was a person, and a person does not round down. I am Vale Sorn, former senior intelligence attaché to the Ketharan hegemony. I watched all of this happen. I have written it down as honestly as I know how. I am setting it down now. I hope someone reads it carefully enough. There is a postscript I want to add, one that I had intended to include but kept putting off because I was not sure how to say it without it sounding like I was trying to make myself feel better about things that are not something anyone should feel better about. I am going to say it anyway, because honesty requires it, and this document has always been about honesty, more than comfort. In the second year after the raid, I requested access to the human communications records from the period immediately following the beacon transmission, the period between when Earth Defense Command received the data and when the first public human response was made, those approximately 14 days of silence. It was a request I did not expect to be granted. It was intelligence material, internal to the human government's decision-making process, and sharing it with a Ketharan intelligence official was not something they were in any way obligated to do. I received the records 6 months after I requested them. They came with a note from a human official, whose name I will not record here because I did not have permission to share it. The note said simply, "We thought you should understand the full picture." What those records contained was not what I expected. I had expected to find a government moving smoothly into crisis response mode, a coordinated, efficient machine activating its systems, the kind of operation that produces the result we had witnessed. What I found was something different. I found the records of 14 days in which real people in real rooms made decisions under conditions of enormous grief and pressure and uncertainty. I found records of disagreements about the right response. I found records of voices that argued for restraint and voices that argued for something else entirely, and the long process of working through those arguments toward a decision. I found evidence of leaders who were not sleeping much, and who said things in internal communications that were raw and personal, and not at all the language of calm institutional response. The calm I had observed from the outside was real, but it had been built, in those 14 days, through a great deal of internal work that was not calm at all. It had been earned, in that specific period, by people who were grieving and afraid and uncertain, and who had chosen, through that grief and fear and uncertainty, to do the harder and slower and more considered thing rather than the faster and more satisfying thing. That choice had not been automatic. It had not been guaranteed. There had been moments in those records where the other choice was close, where the argument for something less measured was powerful and nearly persuasive, where the thing that finally kept the operation within the parameters it stayed within was individual people, in individual moments, choosing to hold to the principle when the principle was most costly to hold. I have thought about those 14 days, and about those people, many times since. There is a quality of moral effort that does not show from the outside. When you see a result that appears controlled and intentional, you can easily assume that the control and intention came easily, that they were natural products of a kind of species-level discipline that required no individual effort to maintain. The human records of those 14 days corrected that assumption completely and permanently. The discipline was real, the precision was real, the intentionality was real, and they had been constructed, in those days, by individual human beings choosing, one decision at a time, to be the thing they needed to be, when being something else would have been much easier. That is not a species quality, that is a human quality. Individual humans, with individual griefs and individual fears, making individual choices in the direction of something harder than the available alternative. I find this more meaningful than the fleet, more meaningful than the precise targeting or the evacuation corridors, or the formal tribunal, or any of the institutional structures and outcomes that followed. Because the institutional structures and outcomes required the choices to come first. The choices required people who could have chosen differently and did not. I want to name one of them, because I have permission to do so. The records indicate that the officer who, on the 11th day, made the final decision to set the parameters of the operation the way they were set, the parameters that produced the evacuation corridors, and the civilian protection protocols, and the precise target list, was a man named Daniel Hughes. He was 67 years old. He had grandchildren. He had been in the Earth Defense Command for 40 years. He had been at his post without sleep for approximately 60 hours when he signed the operational order. He died 4 years later of a cardiac condition unrelated to any of this. He did not, from what I understand, talk publicly about his role in the operation. He was not someone who sought recognition. I know his name. I wanted someone outside the human records to know it too. He made the choice that shaped everything else. He made it when he was 67 years old and exhausted and grieving, and under every kind of pressure, and he made it in the direction of something harder than what was immediately available. That matters. It matters completely. I met Harmon once, in person, at the Compact's second annual session. She had retired from active command and was serving in an advisory capacity. She was smaller than she had appeared on the communication screen, which is often how people are in person. We spoke briefly. She knew who I was. She was polite and attentive and did not waste words. I asked her, because I had always wanted to ask her, what she had felt in the moment when she opened that first communication channel with the Primarch. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "I kept thinking about the count, 39,812. I kept thinking that the person on the other side of this call had that number available to him and had not thought it was a reason to do anything differently. And I kept thinking that my job, at that moment, was to give him a very clear understanding of what would happen if he continued to hold that position. "Were you afraid?" I asked. She looked at me steadily. "I was afraid of making a mistake," she said, "of doing more harm than necessary, of getting the parameters wrong. That is what I was afraid of, not of them." I thought about Daniel Hughes, exhausted at his desk, setting the parameters. The two of them were connected, I realized. His choice had made her precision possible. Her precision had made everything else possible. I thanked her, and she moved on to the next conversation. I stood for a while in the compact session hall and looked at the room full of representatives of 16 species and thought about how much effort it had taken to get everyone into that room, and how much effort it would take to keep them there, and whether the trajectory Orwell had described would hold. I thought about Sam's grandfather, counting every name, getting everyone exactly right. I thought about Fiona Caldwell, treating a patient in the rubble. I thought about Bryn and the single tone of acknowledgement. I thought about Alan at the memorial stone, saying it mattered to be present. I thought about Carla's message, "You saw us. That matters." I thought about Petra asking why, and going deep enough that the why was actually answered rather than papered over. I thought about the 39,812 people who should have been in that hall and were not, because we had classified them as not worth noticing. I will not stop thinking about them. That is, I believe, the appropriate response. Not paralysis, not guilt that substitutes for action, but continued thinking, continued attention, continued showing up to the work of making the structures better, so that the next time someone tries to classify someone else as not worth noticing, the structures are strong enough to say, "No, that is not how this works. Not here, not anymore." That is the goal, not achieved, not guaranteed, being built, every day, by people who choose to build it when they could choose otherwise. I am one of those people now, in my small way. I have this document, and I have the archive, and I have the conversations with Petra and Dara and Sam and all the others, and I have 39 years of knowing what not paying attention looks like, and 31 years of being the person who was paying attention when nobody else was. It is enough to work with. It has to be. The last entry in my sealed journal, the one I wrote to myself on the night after the raid, and dated so that I would know when the warning had been given, contains a line that I wrote without knowing exactly why I wrote it. I read it back years later and understood it better. It says, "Someone has to remember accurately. Let it be you. I have tried. I will keep trying." The star above Haven's Ridge is called Elliot, after the first child born there. The child Elliot would have been 34 years old at the time I am finishing this document. The star will burn for another 4 billion years or so, which is a very long time, long enough for many things to be built and rebuilt and built again. I think that is, in its own way, hopeful.